Joseph didn't even close the door when he said it. The smell of slow-braised short ribs filled the kitchen, rich and heavy, clinging to the air like something permanent. I was standing at the stove, wooden spoon in my hand, watching the sauce thicken the way I'd been taught in culinary school, low heat, patience, no rushing. Behind me, I heard the dull thud of his briefcase hitting the hardwood floor. I slept with her. He said it the way someone announces a delayed flight. No tremor. No apology. Just information. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet bubbling of the pot and the steady tick of the wall clock above the fridge. I turned off the burner before I turned around. When I finally faced him, I noticed two things. His tie was loosened, and there was a faint smear of lipstick near his collar. Not bright red, subtle. Like this had been happening long enough to stop being careful. I wiped my hands on a dish towel. With who? I asked. Though I already knew. Amanda. From work. Of course. I pulled out my chair at the kitchen table and sat down. The plate in front of me was still warm. I cut into the meat, lifted a bite to my mouth, and chewed slowly. He watched me like he was waiting for a glass to shatter against the wall. I swallowed. Do you want a divorce? I asked. His forehead creased. That wasn't the reaction he had prepared for. I don't think this marriage is working anymore, he said carefully. We've grown apart. I nodded once. Then let's not drag it out. He thought confessing was the hardest part. He had no idea what I was about to keep. He started explaining immediately, like he'd rehearsed it in the car. Amanda was 32, a data analyst on his team. Smart. Driven. She understood the pressure of his job as a software engineer. They'd worked late on a security project. One thing led to another. He didn't plan it. It just happened. Affairs always just happen. He kept using words like complicated and distance and emotional disconnect. He never used betrayal. He never used cheated. The language was clean, sanitized. Like he was presenting a case study at work. I watched his mouth move and remembered 9 years compressed into a few sentences. 9 years of shared rent, shared passwords, shared Sunday mornings. 5 years married. A condo in downtown Chicago we thought meant permanence. Are you in love with her? I asked. He hesitated. I care about her. That wasn't an answer. He ran a hand through his hair. I didn't want to lie to you. I almost laughed at that. He hadn't wanted to lie. Just to sleep with someone else first. Okay, I said simply. He blinked. Okay, we'll file tomorrow. The relief that crossed his face was subtle but unmistakable. He had braced himself for screaming, for tears, for a dramatic confrontation he could frame as mutual toxicity. My calm unsettled him more than rage ever would have. You're not even angry, he asked. I looked at him steadily. I'm not surprised. That wasn't entirely true. But the signs had been there. The late-night deployments. The phone turned face down on the table. The sudden gym routine. The way he smiled at texts he wouldn't show me. I thought you'd react, he admitted. I am reacting. Just not the way you expected. The next morning, we sat at the same kitchen counter and divided our life like a spreadsheet. The condo had been his premarital purchase. I didn't fight for it. Our joint savings would be split evenly. I asked for nothing extra. No emotional damages. No dramatic demands. He kept thanking me for being mature. Maturity, I realized, is often confused with silence. At the courthouse, the fluorescent lights made everything look flat. We signed preliminary paperwork. The clerk didn't look up. We were one more couple reducing love to documentation. On the way out, he said, I really appreciate you not making this ugly. I stopped walking and met his eyes. Ugly doesn't need noise, I said. That night, I packed only what I needed. My knives first. Always the knives first. Then clothes. A few books. I left the rest. Before I walked out, I placed the condo keys on the kitchen counter. He was in the bedroom, probably texting Amanda. I didn't say goodbye. My new studio apartment was smaller than our walk-in closet. The radiator hissed like it was breathing. I set my knife roll on the counter and lined each blade up carefully. Order first, then everything else. I sat on the edge of the bed and scrolled through social media out of habit. It didn't take long. Joseph had already posted a photo of him and Amanda at some rooftop bar, her hand resting on his chest. Caption: New beginnings. Honesty matters. Honesty? The comments were congratulatory. A few colleagues from his company left supportive emojis. No one mentioned the wife he'd had 48 hours earlier. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop. There were still a few shared logins we hadn't untangled yet. Insurance portal. Utility accounts. Old email auto-forwards tied to our joint address. Things people forget to disconnect when they're eager to start fresh. I wasn't looking for dirt. I was looking for clarity. If he had risked my heart, that was one thing. If he had risked my health, that was another. I typed in the password he'd used for years. Same one he swore he'd never reuse. The dashboard loaded slowly. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen lighting the small apartment. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I signed the divorce papers. But that night, in the quiet of my studio, I started paying attention. And attention, I've learned, is far more dangerous than anger. The first night alone felt less like grief and more like inventory. The studio apartment smelled faintly of fresh paint and radiator heat. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor. Laptop open, insurance portal still glowing on the screen. The login had worked. That surprised me less than it should have. Joseph had always been careful at work, meticulous with code reviews, obsessed with encryption. At home, he was predictable. Same passwords, same routines, same blind spots. I clicked through our old health insurance dashboard slowly, not because I was shaking, but because I didn't want to miss anything. Coverage history. Primary member, Joseph Turner. Spouse, Emily Turner. I stared at my name for a moment before clicking the next tab. Claims history. There were the usual entries. My urgent care visit 2 winters ago for a kitchen burn. His annual physical. Routine lab panels. Nothing dramatic. Then I saw it. A specialist consultation. Not under my name. Under his date. 6 weeks before he confessed. Provider. Christopher Hale. MD. Facility type. Private clinic. I leaned closer to the screen. The diagnostic code meant nothing to me at first. I copied it into a search tab. My pulse didn't spike. It steadied. The results page loaded. Sexually transmitted infection screening panel. I read it twice. Then I closed the browser and sat back against the wall. He hadn't told me. Not about the affair. Not about the test. If he had slept with Amanda, and then quietly scheduled an STI panel, that meant there was a moment, at least one, where he understood risk, understood consequence, and still came home, sat at our kitchen table, and ate the food I cooked without saying a word. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had shifted. The restaurant was already buzzing when I walked in. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the lights. The prep cooks were slicing fennel and trimming herbs. Orders would start coming in within an hour. Morning. Marcus called from across the kitchen. You good? I'm good, I said automatically. I tied my apron and started reviewing the day's prep list. Lamb reduction, fresh pasta, a dessert tasting for a potential investor. The rhythm of knives against cutting boards grounded me. Precision always did. But between plating and tasting sauces, my mind replayed the date on that insurance claim. 6 weeks. 6 weeks before his confession, which meant he had either already known about Amanda's situation or suspected enough to get tested. I finished my shift without burning a single dish. After work, I didn't go home immediately. I met Hannah at a small cafe in River North. She'd been my friend since community college, now working in financial compliance for a mid-sized firm. She understood policy language the way I understood flavor profiles. You look calm, she said as soon as I sat down. I am calm. That's never a good sign. I slid my phone across the table and showed her the screenshot of the insurance claim. She read it carefully. St. Penil. Private clinic. 6 weeks before he told me. She exhaled slowly. Did he say anything? No. Did you ask? Not yet. Hannah leaned back in her chair. Emily, if he got tested while still married to you and didn't disclose potential exposure, that's more than cheating. That's non-disclosure of health risk. The phrase sounded clinical. Cold, but accurate. I don't want drama, I said. Then don't create drama, she replied. Create documentation. That word again. Documentation. She tapped her fingers on the table. Who's the other woman? Amanda. Data analyst at his company. Hannah's eyes narrowed slightly. You know what's interesting? Companies with strong compliance frameworks take undisclosed conflicts seriously, especially if there's a leadership role involved. He's up for promotion, I said quietly. Executive track. Even more reason, she murmured. I didn't answer right away. My goal wasn't to ruin him. Not yet. My goal was clarity. What if he didn't know? I asked. Hannah gave me a look. He knew enough to get tested. That settled something inside me. When I got back to the studio that night, I scheduled my own doctor's appointment. Not at a private clinic. At my regular provider. I wanted a paper trail. The waiting room the next afternoon smelled like antiseptic and cheap coffee. I filled out the intake form with steady hands. Marital status. Recently divorced. Reason for visit. Routine screening. The nurse didn't ask questions. The doctor didn't pry. Blood was drawn. Swabs taken. It was clinical, efficient. I walked out with a small bandage on my arm and a larger understanding settling into place. This wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It was about consent. That evening, Joseph texted me. Hey, hope you're settling in, okay? I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back. When did you schedule the STI panel? The typing bubble appeared almost instantly. Disappeared. Reappeared. It was nothing. He finally wrote, standard precaution. Before or after you slept with her? A pause. After, and you didn't think I deserved to know? Another pause. Longer this time. I didn't want to scare you over something that turned out negative. Negative? I hadn't even seen the results yet. Only the billing code. So it was negative. I asked. Yes. Everything was fine. I watched the screen. No elaboration. No apology. Send me the results, I replied. A full minute passed. I don't have them saved, he wrote. Of course he didn't. I set my phone down and stared at the wall. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe his results were clean. Maybe Amanda's were too. But maybe wasn't enough anymore. Because somewhere between the bubbling pot of short ribs and the sterile insurance portal, something had shifted inside me. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was auditing. And audits? I knew from watching Hannah work for years. Don't begin with accusations. They begin with timelines. The results came back on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of prepping duck confit when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my chef coat. I didn't check it immediately. Timing matters in a kitchen. So does restraint. After service. I stepped into the alley behind the restaurant and opened the patient portal. Negative. Every line. Every panel. I exhaled slowly. Not with relief exactly, but with clarity. He hadn't infected me. But that didn't erase the silence. I stared at the screen for a long moment before closing it. Clean results didn't mean clean behavior. He had still chosen not to tell me. He had still assessed risk privately and decided I didn't need to know. That decision sat heavier than any diagnosis would have. That night, I opened the insurance portal again. This time, I wasn't just scanning. I was tracing dates, appointments, billing adjustments. There was a second entry under Joseph's account, follow-up lab confirmation. 2 weeks after the first test. I clicked deeper. The clinic name appeared in full this time. Hale Private Medical. I wrote it down. The next morning, before my shift, I called the clinic pretending to confirm insurance coverage for previous testing. The receptionist was polite but guarded. No records would be discussed without direct authorization from the patient. Of course. I hung up and stared at the contact card I had saved. Dr. Christopher Hale, 40 years old. According to the website, internal medicine specialist, private practice, discreet consultations listed prominently on the homepage. Discreet. The word made me uneasy. That afternoon, Hannah called me during her lunch break. I ran Amanda's name through public employment records, she said. She left her previous company abruptly about 8 months ago. Why? No official statement. But there was an internal investigation around that time. HR restructuring. A senior manager stepped down. My fingers tightened around the phone. Resigned. Technically. And there was a civil complaint filed shortly after. Settled privately. The pieces didn't snap together yet. But they aligned. What was the complaint about? I asked. Hannah hesitated. Workplace misconduct. Relationship with subordinate. I closed my eyes briefly. Amanda had been the subordinate. And the manager? I asked. No longer in the industry. Names off most directories. I hung up and sat in silence for a while. If Amanda had been involved with a superior before, and that superior later underwent medical treatment, timelines mattered. I opened LinkedIn and scrolled through Amanda's profile. Current role: Senior Data Analyst at Joseph's company. Previous role: Meridian Analytics. I clicked Meridian. Within minutes, I found archived news about executive turnover last year. A short article buried on page 3 of a business blog mentioned a former department head stepping down amid internal policy review. His name matched the one Hannah had texted me. I searched his name alongside Dr. Christopher Hale. One result: a charity gala photo from 7 months ago. Dr. Hale listed as sponsor. The former executive listed as attendee. They knew each other. I stared at the screen. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidences begin to look like patterns when you trace enough lines. That evening, Joseph called instead of texting. Did you get your results? He asked. Yes. And, I'm fine. A pause. See? I told you. That's not the point. He sighed. Emily, I got tested because I was being responsible. Responsible would have been telling me it was negative. You didn't know that until after the fact. Silence. You're digging into things that don't matter, he said finally. That word again. Matter? Did Amanda get tested? I asked calmly. Another pause. She said she was fine. That's not what I asked. I don't have her medical records, he snapped. Neither do I. Yet, after we hung up, I opened my laptop again. This time, I didn't search for Amanda. I searched for Dr. Hale's clinic review page. One comment caught my eye. Discreet handling of sensitive matters. Highly recommend for confidential testing? Confidential. I wasn't interested in gossip. I was interested in documentation. The next day, Hannah met me after work again. She slid a folded printout across the table. I shouldn't technically have this, she said. It was a redacted civil filing summary. The former executive from Meridian Analytics had undergone treatment for a reportable infection around the same time Amanda left the company. Treatment confirmed, Hannah said quietly. Not public record in detail, but enough to know. The dates aligned with Amanda's employment departure, which aligned with Joseph's testing. My heartbeat didn't quicken. It slowed. If Amanda had been exposed at Meridian, and then entered Joseph's life shortly after, and he had quietly tested himself while still married to me, that wasn't just impulsive cheating. That was a chain of knowledge. A chain he chose not to share. I looked at Hannah. What would you do? She asked. I thought for a long moment. I wouldn't explode. I said, I'd wait. For what? For the moment where truth carries weight. I folded the printout carefully and slid it into my bag. I didn't have Amanda's records. I didn't need them yet. I had something more important. A timeline, And timelines don't lie. Joseph thought the hardest part had been confessing the affair. He still believed the divorce was the consequence. He didn't realize the real reckoning begins when silence meets documentation. And I was very, very patient. Joseph announced their engagement 3 weeks after the divorce papers were finalized. I found out the way everyone else did. LinkedIn. A professional headshot of him in a navy suit. Amanda beside him in a cream dress. Her hand lifted just enough to show the ring. The caption read, "Grateful for new beginnings and honest partnerships." Honest? The word sat on the screen like a dare. The comments poured in almost immediately. Colleagues congratulating him. A senior VP calling it a beautiful new chapter. Someone joked about finally making it official. Not one mention of the wife he had just left. I didn't feel the sting I thought I would. Instead, I felt something sharper. Calculation. If he was positioning himself as a model of integrity publicly, timing would matter more than ever. That night, I didn't call Hannah. I didn't text Joseph. I opened a spreadsheet. Column 1. Dates. Column 2. Amanda's departure from Meridian Analytics. Column 3. Former executive's treatment period. Column 4. Joseph's STI panel. Column 5. Date of confession. Column 6. Divorce filing. Column 7. Engagement announcement. Lined up like that. The pattern was almost elegant. The executive at Meridian had begun treatment approximately 2 weeks before Amanda left the company. Joseph's test came roughly a month after Amanda started at his firm. He had confessed 6 weeks later. He proposed 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. It wasn't chaos. It was sequence. The next morning, while I was trimming asparagus for a private tasting, Marcus nudged me with his elbow. "You see the engagement?" he asked quietly. I didn't look up. "Yeah." "You okay?" "I'm busy," I said. He nodded once and dropped it. I appreciated that about him. No forced sympathy. Just presence. That afternoon, Hannah called. "I saw it," she said. "So did everyone else." "Do you think he disclosed the relationship timeline to his company?" "I doubt it. Executive track candidates usually sign updated ethics disclosures when entering serious personal relationships within the company," she said carefully. "Especially if one partner reports up the chain. Amanda works under him. Technically under his division. Indirect reporting line. But still conflict adjacent. Conflict adjacent." I leaned against the prep table and wiped my hands on my apron. "What happens if disclosure wasn't complete?" I asked. "Internal review. At minimum. And if there was non-disclosure of health risk while married, that's more personal," she said slowly. "But if it intersects with workplace policy, especially during company travel or benefits coverage, it could matter." I hung up with that word echoing again. Matter. Later that evening, Joseph texted, "I hope you're doing well." I didn't respond. Another message followed. "I didn't mean for you to find out online." I stared at it for a moment before typing back. "Was there ever a plan to tell me?" He called instead of replying. "I was going to," he said as soon as I answered. "I just didn't want to rub it in." "Rub what in?" "That I'm moving on?" "You moved on before you confessed." He exhaled. "Emily, don't turn this into something bigger than it is." I almost smiled. "It already is bigger than you think." "What does that mean?" "It means honesty isn't a caption." Silence filled the line. "You're still angry," he said finally. "No," I answered. "I'm observant." After we hung up, I opened Amanda's profile again. She had updated her headline. Future Mrs. I scrolled further down and found something new. A tagged photo from a company planning committee meeting. The caption mentioned the annual TechSphere Leadership Summit coming up in 2 months. Joseph was listed as keynote speaker. Topic: Integrity and Innovation. I leaned back in my chair. A keynote address. Full executive board in attendance. Investors. Press. Live streamed. The kind of environment where optics mattered more than truth, unless truth arrived uninvited. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. Ms. Turner, a male voice asked. Yes. This is Dr. Christopher Hale's office returning your earlier inquiry regarding insurance billing clarification. I hadn't expected that call to come back to me. Yes, I said calmly. I had questions about a previous claim under shared coverage. I can't disclose patient records without authorization, he replied, voice professional and neutral. However, if there are concerns regarding exposure or notification protocol, those matters can be addressed formally. Notification protocol. The phrase tightened something inside my chest. What qualifies as notification protocol? I asked. If a patient tests reactive for certain infections, they are strongly advised to notify recent partners, he said carefully. Some jurisdictions require documentation of that advisory, and if they don't, failure to disclose can carry civil implications, depending on circumstances. Civil implications. I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't have Amanda's records. I didn't need them yet. What I needed was confirmation that advisory language existed. That notification wasn't optional. It was recommended at minimum. I opened my spreadsheet again and added another column. Column 8. Advisory obligation. The summit was 8 weeks away. Joseph would stand on stage speaking about integrity. Amanda would likely be in the audience. The executive board would be watching. I closed my laptop slowly. Revenge, I realized, is loud when it's emotional. But strategic accountability, that's quiet. And I had just found the room where quiet travels the farthest. The first time I contacted a private investigator, I almost hung up. The number had been passed to me by Hannah through a colleague who dealt with corporate due diligence cases. His name was Victor Lang. Former law enforcement. Discreet. Expensive. Ms. Turner, he said after the second ring. His voice was steady. Unhurried. I understand you're looking into a timeline. Yes. Is this a domestic matter or a corporate one? Both, I answered. There was a brief pause. Not surprised. Just assessing. Start with what you know. So I did. Amanda's departure from Meridian Analytics. The executive who stepped down. The treatment timeline. Joseph's private STI panel. The upcoming TechSphere Leadership Summit. I'm not interested in gossip, I said clearly. I need documented patterns. You're looking for corroboration, he replied. Yes. And what do you intend to do with it? That depends on what it shows. He didn't push further. He gave me a rate. I didn't flinch. Some investments aren't about money. 2 days later, we met in person at a quiet coffee shop near the Loop. He was older than I expected. Late 40s. Maybe early 50s. Observant eyes. No small talk. He opened a thin folder on the table. Preliminary findings, he said. Inside were printouts. Amanda had left Meridian under what was labeled as voluntary resignation. However, internal restructuring notes, sourced from someone willing to talk, suggested an inappropriate relationship between her and the executive had triggered review. The executive, Thomas Avery, had begun private medical treatment shortly before stepping down. Treatment confirmed, I asked. Confirmed through billing records, Victor said. I can't access full diagnosis without subpoena, but I can confirm specialty type and duration. Which specialty? Infectious disease consultation, followed by private internal medicine visits. Dr. Christopher Hale's clinic was listed as one of the providers. My pulse stayed steady. What about Amanda? I asked. She sought consultation at the same clinic within 3 weeks of Mr. Avery's first documented visit. My hands rested flat on the table. Consultation for what? Billing code suggests laboratory screening. I didn't need him to translate. And after she joined Joseph's company, another lab consultation. Approximately 1 month later, Joseph's panel. Sequence. Victor watched my expression carefully. You need to understand something, he said. Medical privacy is heavily protected. What you have so far is correlation. I don't need diagnosis, I replied. I need alignment. He nodded once. There's more. he added. He slid another page across the table. Amanda and Joseph had traveled together to a regional tech conference 6 weeks before his confession. Company-sponsored. Shared hotel block. They were photographed at a networking event, Victor said. Nothing inappropriate in the image itself. But timing mattered. Was Amanda required to file any disclosure regarding personal relationships within the company? I asked. That would depend on internal policy. I'll get that. When I walked out of the cafe, the air felt sharper than before. Not because I was angry, because the lines were clearer. That night, I reviewed the TechSphere Corporate Governance Handbook online. Publicly accessible PDF. Section 12. Conflict of Interest Disclosure. Executives and senior management must report romantic or sexual relationships with employees in subordinate or related reporting structures. Failure to disclose may result in disciplinary action. I read it twice. Joseph had been promoted to senior engineering lead 4 months ago. Amanda reported within his division. Had he filed a disclosure? The next morning, while reducing a balsamic glaze, my phone buzzed. It was Victor. I spoke with someone familiar with internal compliance processes at TechSphere. He said, "There's no record of formal disclosure regarding Mrs. Lang and Mr. Turner prior to the engagement announcement." My chest didn't tighten. It steadied. And now that the engagement is public, HR may require retroactive documentation. But timing could raise questions. Timing. Everything was timing. That afternoon, Joseph called. "You hired someone," he said flatly. I didn't ask how he knew. "You've been digging," he continued. "I've been verifying. You're turning this into a corporate witch hunt." "No," I said evenly. "I'm turning it into a timeline." He exhaled sharply. "You're not going to get anything out of this. That's not why I'm doing it." "Then why?" I thought about that for a second. "Because you made a decision for me without my consent." Silence. "This is about control," he said finally. "Yes," I replied. "It is." After we hung up, I opened my spreadsheet again. I added more rows. Conference travel date. Engagement post. Policy clause citation. The leadership summit was now 6 weeks away. Victor sent one final email that night. Subject line. Additional alignment. Inside was confirmation that Amanda had signed a new employment contract at TechSphere that included an ethics acknowledgement clause. Signed 3 months before the engagement announcement, meaning she had formally acknowledged disclosure obligations while already in a relationship. I closed the email and stared at the ceiling of my studio. This wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't even about infection anymore. It was about non-disclosure. About standing on a stage and talking about integrity while bypassing the very structures designed to protect others. The summit wasn't just a keynote. It was a spotlight. And spotlights don't ask permission before they illuminate. I didn't know exactly how I would use what I had yet. But for the first time since he walked into the kitchen and said, "I slept with her," I felt something shift. Not rage. Not grief. Leverage. And leverage, when applied correctly, doesn't shout. It presses. At the exact right moment. The invitation to the TechSphere Leadership Summit arrived in my inbox 3 days later. Not from Joseph. From the public events mailing list. Join us for a powerful evening of insight and innovation. The header read, featuring senior engineering lead Joseph Turner. Integrity and innovation. Integrity. I clicked the registration link out of habit. General admission. Corporate partners. Press access. Livestream credentials. I didn't register. Instead, I forwarded the email to Hannah with a single line. "This is the stage." She replied within minutes. "Then you need documentation that holds under scrutiny." I already knew that. That afternoon, Victor sent another message. "I've secured confirmation of 2 separate lab consultations for Amanda at Hale Private Medical." He wrote, "Dates align with Meridian departure and TechSphere employment start. No diagnosis. No test result. But documented visits." I stared at the screen. Correlation wasn't proof. But proof wasn't always required to initiate review. That night, I scheduled a consultation of my own, not with a doctor, but with a compliance attorney Hannah recommended. His office was sleek, minimalist, glass walls, quiet carpeting, the kind of place where words are chosen carefully. "I'm not interested in litigation," I said as soon as we sat down. "Then what are you interested in?" he asked. "Protocol." He leaned back slightly. "Explain." I outlined the timeline. Affair. Undisclosed STI testing. Possible prior exposure through Amanda's previous workplace relationship. Executive disclosure policies at TechSphere. Upcoming summit. "I want to understand what constitutes a compliance concern," I said. "Not revenge. Concern." He listened without interrupting. If an executive candidate engaged in a romantic relationship within his reporting structure and failed to disclose it in accordance with company policy, that's a compliance issue, he said. If there was also non-disclosure of health-related risk to a spouse while maintaining shared insurance benefits, that could intersect with fiduciary concerns. Fiduciary? The word felt heavier than anything else. "What about medical privacy?" I asked. "You cannot publicly distribute protected medical information," he replied. "But if you submit documentation to an internal compliance board through appropriate channels, that is not public dissemination. That is reporting." Reporting. I let that settle. "And if I did nothing?" I asked. "Then nothing happens. Simple. Clean." I left his office with a small folder of printed policy excerpts and one clear understanding. Timing would determine impact. The summit was positioned as a celebration of corporate ethics. The executive board would be present. So would investors. If disclosure irregularities surfaced quietly before the event, they might be handled internally without visibility. If surfaced during heightened visibility, the review would be unavoidable. I walked along the river that evening. Cold wind biting against my face. Chicago lights flickered across the water. I thought about the night Joseph confessed. He had expected tears. He hadn't expected patience. The next morning, Joseph texted again. "You're going to the summit, aren't you?" I didn't respond immediately. "Emily," he wrote, "if this is about humiliating me, don't." I typed back slowly. "Is there something you're afraid of being seen?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. I disclosed everything necessary. He replied, "Necessary." I forwarded that message to Victor. "Within hours," he responded. "There is no formal disclosure filed prior to the engagement announcement," he confirmed. "HR record reflects acknowledgement after public engagement post. Retroactive." I sat at my kitchen table that night. Laptop open, assembling a file. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Chronological. Tab 1. Insurance claim screenshots showing Joseph's STI panel while married. Tab 2. Meridian Executive Resignation Summary and Treatment Timeline Alignment. Tab 3. Amanda's Lab Consultation Confirmations. Tab 4. TechSphere Conflict of Interest Policy. Tab 5. Joseph's Promotion Documentation. Tab 6. Engagement Announcement Timestamp. No speculation. Only dates. Only alignment. I saved the file under a neutral name. Documentation package. My phone buzzed again. "Joseph, we need to talk." I answered. "What?" "If you're planning something, think about the consequences," he said. "Not just for me." "For who?" I asked calmly. "For Amanda. She acknowledged policy when she signed her contract." I said. "She's an adult. You're going to ruin careers." "No," I replied. "Policy does that when ignored." Silence. "You've changed," he said. "No," I answered. I stopped absorbing. The summit was now 3 weeks away. I opened the event page again. There was a livestream contact email for technical coordination inquiries. There was also a compliance reporting link buried at the bottom of the company website. Anonymous submissions accepted. Anonymous. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumph. I felt precision. This wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It was about alignment between words and actions. If Joseph wanted to stand on a stage and talk about integrity, then integrity needed to be examined. Not by me shouting, by process. I closed my laptop and stared at the dark screen. Some people think revenge is about destroying someone publicly, but the most devastating consequences are often institutional. They come from within the system the person trusted to protect them. And systems respond to documentation, not emotion. 3 weeks. That was all the time left before the spotlight turned on. And I already knew exactly where to send the file. The summit week arrived colder than expected. Chicago wind cut through my coat as I stepped out of a cab 2 blocks from the TechSphere Convention Center. I wasn't on the guest list. I didn't need to be. I wasn't there to sit in the audience. I was there to confirm timing. The building was all glass and polished steel. Banners hanging across the entrance. TechSphere Leadership Summit, Integrity and Innovation. I stood across the street and watched executives file inside. Tailored suits, polished smiles. Investors with badges clipped neatly to their lapels. Somewhere in that crowd was Joseph. Confident. Prepared. Ready to speak about ethics. I didn't feel a spike of anger. I felt stillness. I walked into a cafe across from the convention center and opened my laptop. Wi-Fi connected instantly. The livestream preview page was already live, looping a promotional video of Joseph's previous talks. He looked composed, measured, trustworthy. I opened the documentation package. Every tab was clean. Every date verified. Every screenshot labeled. I had spent the past 2 weeks refining it, removing anything that felt emotional, removing any sentence that could be interpreted as accusation. It was only facts now. Timeline. Policy. Alignment. My phone buzzed. Victor. They've begun internal pre-event compliance checks. He wrote. Standard procedure before high-visibility speaking engagements. I stared at the message. Standard procedure. Which meant the compliance office would be active. Monitoring. Available. I opened TechSphere's internal reporting portal again. Anonymous submission. Encrypted upload. I didn't upload anything yet. Instead, I clicked over to the live stream schedule. Joseph's keynote was scheduled for 8:15 p.m. The board panel would be seated behind him. Major investors in the front rows. Press credentials granted to several industry blogs. I checked the time. 7:10. I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured our kitchen the night he confessed. The short ribs. The wooden spoon. The calm in my voice when I asked for divorce. He had wanted an explosion. What he was about to face was pressure. Different. More precise. At 7:25, my phone rang. Joseph? I let it go to voicemail. Seconds later, a text appeared. Why are you near the convention center? He had seen me. Maybe from the glass entrance. Maybe through a mutual colleague. I typed back. I'm not inside. That doesn't answer my question. I'm confirming something. A pause. Emily, don't do this tonight. Do what? You know what? I looked at the banner across the street again. Integrity. You're about to talk about honesty, I replied. If everything's clean, there's nothing to worry about. Another pause. We disclosed. He wrote, It's handled. Retroactively. I answered. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then one final message. Please. I set my phone face down on the table. At 7:40, I logged into the livestream test feed. The stage was visible now. Bright lights. A massive LED screen behind the podium. The TechSphere logo glowing in blue. A tech crew member adjusted microphones. A moderator tested audio. The screen behind the podium flashed the summit agenda. Joseph Turner, Integrity in Innovation. My cursor hovered over the compliance submission portal. There was an option to schedule document delivery to internal ethics officers directly. Timestamped. I checked the policy handbook again. All executives must ensure full transparency in reporting romantic relationships within division structures. Failure to disclose prior to promotion review may result in corrective action. Promotion review. Joseph's executive track evaluation was scheduled for next quarter, meaning this speech wasn't just symbolic. It was evaluative. At 7:55, the auditorium filled. Through the live stream, I could see silhouettes settling into seats. The camera zoomed briefly toward the front row. Amanda sat beside him. Cream blazer? Polished smile. Ring visible. She leaned toward him and whispered something. He nodded. Confident. My heart did not race. It anchored. 7:58. I attached the documentation package to the encrypted portal. Subject line: Conflict of Interest Review, Timeline Submission. No emotional commentary. No threats. Just, please review attached documentation for alignment with internal policy regarding disclosure obligations and executive conduct. Submitted by a concerned party. I did not press send. Not yet. 8:12. The moderator stepped onto the stage. Tonight, she said into the microphone, we're honored to welcome one of our rising leaders. Applause. Joseph walked up to the podium. He looked straight ahead. Professional. Assured. He began speaking. Integrity, he said, isn't just a value. It's a decision we make every day. I watched his mouth form the word. Integrity. My finger rested lightly on the trackpad. This wasn't about humiliating him in front of cameras. This wasn't about exposing medical details publicly. It was about timing internal review when visibility ensured accountability. 8:15. He continued. When we innovate, we must also ensure transparency. Transparency. I inhaled once, then pressed send. The confirmation message appeared instantly. Submission received. Timestamp recorded. I closed my laptop slowly. Across the street, applause swelled inside the convention center. Joseph kept speaking. He had no idea that while he stood under bright stage lights talking about honesty, a compliance file was moving quietly through the system designed to evaluate him. I stood up from the cafe table, wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck, and stepped back into the Chicago night. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't inside that auditorium. I had only pressed a button. And sometimes, that's all it takes. My phone vibrated before I reached the end of the block. Victor. It's moving fast. The message read. I didn't respond. I kept walking, heels clicking against the pavement, the wind sharp against my face. The convention center behind me glowed blue and silver, unaware that something invisible had already begun shifting inside it. 2 minutes later, another vibration. Hannah. They opened the file. I stopped beneath a street lamp and typed back. How do you know? Compliance portal auto-acknowledges internal routing. It's flagged for urgent review. Urgent. Inside the auditorium. Joseph was still speaking. I opened the live stream on my phone as I walked. He was mid-sentence, describing how leaders must model ethical courage. The irony didn't feel satisfying. It felt inevitable. A small notification banner appeared at the top of my screen. TechSphere internal notice, confidential. I couldn't access it. But the timestamp aligned exactly with my submission. Victor called this time. They've escalated it to executive review, he said. Given the visibility tonight, they won't wait. What does that mean? I asked. It means someone is probably in a control room right now verifying documentation. The livestream camera shifted briefly to a wide shot of the audience. I saw the executive board seated in the front row. 2 of them leaned toward each other, whispering. The moderator stood near the side of the stage, glancing toward the technical crew. Joseph continued speaking. And when challenges arise, transparency is the only path forward. His phone buzzed on the podium. I saw it clearly. He ignored it. A stagehand approached the edge of the platform, gesturing subtly toward the side curtains. Joseph didn't look yet. Another vibration on my phone. Hannah. They're reviewing the insurance screenshots now. I swallowed slowly. Public, I typed. No. Internal. Good. That mattered. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted review. The livestream feed flickered for half a second. Joseph paused mid-sentence. Just barely. He recovered quickly. Professional instinct. But the moderator stepped forward unexpectedly. Apologies for a brief technical check, she said into the microphone. Joseph turned his head slightly toward her. Confusion flickered across his face. The giant LED screen behind him momentarily went black, then returned to the summit logo. He tried to continue, but this time, a man in a dark suit approached from stage right. He leaned toward Joseph and whispered something into his ear. The camera cut away abruptly to a promotional video. My pulse didn't spike. It steadied. Victor's voice came through my phone again. They've confirmed no prior disclosure filing, he said. That's a direct policy breach. And Amanda? I asked. Her ethics acknowledgement is on file. That strengthens the issue. I leaned against a building and watched the live stream shift to an extended sponsor reel. The chat section filled with confusion. Technical issues. Is the feed down? Inside the convention center, something was happening behind the curtains. My phone lit up again. Joseph. I didn't answer. A voicemail notification followed immediately. I didn't listen. The live stream returned to the stage, but Joseph was gone. The moderator stood alone. We're taking a brief intermission, she said carefully. Please enjoy refreshments while we address an internal matter. Internal matter. The phrase felt almost poetic. My phone rang again. Joseph. I stepped into a quieter side street and answered this time. What did you do? He demanded. I submitted documentation. You blindsided me. You blindsided me first. This is corporate suicide. No, I said calmly. It's review. You could have talked to me. I did. You're humiliating me in front of the board. They're evaluating policy. He exhaled sharply. They're asking about the disclosure timeline. You should answer honestly. Silence. They're asking about Amanda's prior treatment, he continued. Voice lower now. They're asking whether I knew. Did you? I asked. Another silence. I knew she had a screening, he admitted. She said it was precautionary. And you? I tested too, and didn't tell me. That wasn't relevant to the company. It was relevant to integrity. He didn't reply. In the background, I could hear muffled voices. A door closing. Movement. They're postponing my keynote, he said finally. Okay. That promotion review. It's frozen. Frozen. The word echoed in my mind. Not destroyed. Not terminated. Frozen. You've made your point, he said bitterly. I didn't make a point. I replied. I submitted facts. You could have ruined everything. I didn't leak anything publicly. He went quiet again. The live stream ended abruptly with a "will reschedule" graphic. Across the river, the summit banners still hung proudly against the glass facade. But inside, something had shifted. They're requesting a formal statement from both of us, Joseph said at last. Then give one. You're not even inside, he added, almost disbelieving. I never planned to be. He didn't understand that part. He had expected confrontation in the room. Tears in the hallway. A scene. Instead, he was facing a system. And systems don't argue. They audit. I have to go, he said abruptly. Okay. He hung up first. I stood alone under the Chicago night sky, wind pressing against my coat. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't posted. I hadn't exposed medical records on social media. I had pressed a button that sent documentation to the place designed to process it. Nothing more, nothing less. My phone buzzed one last time. Victor. They've initiated formal review. I typed back one word. Understood. Then I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked home, leaving the convention center glowing behind me. The spotlight had turned on. Not because I dragged it there. Because it was always waiting for alignment. Joseph's voicemail arrived at 6:30 the next morning. I was already awake, standing in my kitchen, whisking eggs for a catering order when my phone lit up with his name. I let it ring out. When it stopped, the notification icon glowed red against the screen. I didn't listen to it immediately. Instead, I finished the hollandaise. Precision first, emotion later. When I finally pressed play, his voice was tight. "They're calling it a compliance review," he said. "It's being blown out of proportion. You didn't have to escalate it like this." I set the spoon down and replayed the message once more. Escalate. That was how he framed it. An escalation. As if the timeline had been a weapon instead of a mirror. My email chimed while I was still staring at the screen. Subject: temporary administrative adjustment. I opened it. A formal notice from TechSphere's internal communications department had been forwarded through an industry contact. Joseph Turner had been placed on temporary administrative leave, pending review of disclosure documentation. Administrative leave? Not termination. Not public disgrace. Just removal from visibility. I read the statement twice. In alignment with our commitment to transparency and ethical leadership, the language was sterile, controlled, but definitive. I leaned back against the counter and let the silence settle. This wasn't chaos. This was process. My phone buzzed again. "Hannah, they've opened a secondary review," she wrote. "Amanda's contract and acknowledgement forms are part of it." "What does that mean?" I typed. "It means it's not just about him anymore." An hour later, industry blogs began posting subtle updates. TechSphere adjusts leadership lineup following internal review. No details. No names beyond the official statement. But the comment section was restless. Speculation always fills empty space. Amanda's LinkedIn profile changed by noon. Her headline disappeared. By afternoon, her entire account was temporarily unavailable. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt gravity. Joseph called at 3:15. I answered this time. "They suspended me," he said without greeting. I read the notice. "You're proud of this." "No. They're questioning whether I knowingly failed to disclose." "Did you?" He exhaled hard. "I thought it was handled." "That wasn't my question." He went silent. "They're also reviewing Amanda's acknowledgement timeline," he continued. "They're asking about her previous employment." "Which part?" "Her exit from Meridian." "And?" "They're pulling compliance archives." I pictured the folder on my laptop. Every date, every alignment. "They're acting like I endangered someone." He snapped. "You did," I replied quietly. I tested negative. "You tested quietly. That doesn't mean—" "It means you chose not to inform me." Silence again. "They're saying my promotion track is paused indefinitely," he said finally. Paused. That word again. Not destroyed. Not revoked. Paused. Amanda's situation was worse. By evening, Victor confirmed through his sources that she had been placed on unpaid leave pending internal ethics review. Her prior workplace conduct was under inquiry. She might be terminated, he said over the phone. "Depending on what they uncover." I leaned against the window of my apartment and watched the city traffic below. "I didn't send anything about her prior executive publicly," I said. "You didn't need to," he replied. "Once the board started reviewing, they connected their own dots." That was the part Joseph didn't understand. I hadn't delivered accusations. I had delivered structure. Systems protect themselves. When gaps appear, they fill them. By nightfall, a second memo circulated internally at TechSphere. A colleague forwarded it anonymously. Joseph was to step down from keynote speaking engagements until further notice. Amanda's name was no longer listed on any upcoming project briefs. The collapse wasn't loud. It was administrative. My phone vibrated again. "Joseph, I need you to clarify something," he said as soon as I answered. "What?" "They're asking whether I informed you about the STI screening before the divorce." "Did you?" "No." "Then I'll answer honestly." He made a sound somewhere between frustration and disbelief. "You could soften this," he said. "You could say you don't remember." "I remember. They're implying I created risk exposure." "You did." "I didn't infect you." "That's not the standard." He fell quiet. For the first time since the confession, he sounded unsure. Not defensive. Not angry. Uncertain. You've always been calm, he said slowly. But this isn't calm. This is calculated. Yes, I never thought you'd go this far. I never thought you'd go that far, I replied. We sat in silence for several seconds. Then he said something softer. They're asking if I would have disclosed if we had stayed married. The question hung there. And, I prompted, I don't know. That was the truth. And it was worse than any lie. I ended the call gently. Not angrily. Not triumphantly. Gently. By the time I went to bed, the industry chatter had shifted tone. No one was accusing, but no one was celebrating either. Reputation doesn't shatter in one blow. It erodes under review. Amanda's engagement photo disappeared overnight. Joseph's account stopped posting. The world didn't burn. It adjusted. And in that adjustment, something irreversible had already happened. For the first time in 9 years, Joseph wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for control. And I wasn't giving it back. He was waiting outside the restaurant when my shift ended. It was nearly midnight, the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Most of the staff had already left. The city felt quieter than usual, the kind of stillness that comes after a long day of noise. Joseph stood near the curb, hands in his coat pockets. No suit tonight. No polished conference demeanor. Just him. You could have warned me, he said as I approached. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder. About what? About submitting that file the night of the summit. I didn't know I was required to notify you before following policy. His jaw tightened. You timed it deliberately. Yes. At the worst possible moment. No, I said evenly. At the most visible one. He looked at me like he was trying to find the woman who used to share his bed in my face. They're saying I may be demoted, he said. Executive track is off the table. That's their decision. You started it. I documented it. We stood there in the cold for a moment, the air between us heavier than the wind. They're asking about the health disclosure, he continued. Whether I informed you about potential exposure. You didn't? I didn't think it was necessary. That's the problem. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding through his composure. You're acting like I committed a crime. You violated trust. That's personal. It became professional when you ignored policy. He exhaled sharply. Amanda told me her screening was precautionary. And you believed her. Yes. And still got tested yourself. He didn't answer immediately. Yes, he admitted finally. So you recognized risk. That doesn't mean... It means you knew enough to protect yourself. I cut in quietly. Just not enough to inform me? His shoulders sagged slightly. They're reviewing whether I knowingly failed to disclose a relationship within my division, he said. They're digging into email timestamps. Because you didn't file until after the engagement post. They're treating that as intentional concealment. Was it? He looked away this time. I didn't want it on record before I knew how serious it was, he said. Serious? That word again. Serious enough to marry. I said, that's different. How? He didn't have an answer. A car drove past, headlights briefly illuminating his face. He looked tired. Not destroyed. Not broken. Just tired. They asked if I ever told you about the screening, he said. I said no. Good. They asked if I would have... And he hesitated. I don't know. The honesty surprised me. I thought I was containing it, he added quietly. Handling it. You were containing information, I said. Not risk. He rubbed his temples like he used to when debugging complicated code. They're talking about demotion, he repeated. Maybe moving me back to a senior engineering role? No leadership oversight. No keynote opportunities. That's consequence. You're not even angry, he said, almost accusingly. I replied. I just didn't express it loudly. He studied me. You've changed? No, I said softly. I stopped absorbing. He looked down at the pavement. They're reviewing Amanda's prior employment, too, he said. She might lose her job. She signed acknowledgement of policy, I replied. She's responsible for her choices. You could have talked to me privately. I did. The night you confessed. That's not what I mean. You mean I could have kept it quiet? He didn't deny it. You think this is revenge? He said. It's accountability. You wanted to hurt me. I wanted you evaluated by the same standards you were about to preach. He let out a humorless laugh. Integrity and innovation. Yes? Silence settled again. For the first time since he had walked into our kitchen and said, I slept with her. He looked uncertain rather than defensive. They asked me if I knowingly exposed my spouse to health risk without disclosure, he said quietly. And what did you say? I said I didn't think it was significant. I held his gaze. Significance isn't determined by comfort, I said. He swallowed. They asked if I'd withdraw my promotion application, he added. Voluntarily. And I haven't answered. The street felt colder now. You always said you wanted leadership, I said. Leadership requires transparency. He shook his head slowly. You're relentless. No, I said. I'm consistent. A long pause stretched between us. Did you ever love me? He asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said without hesitation. Then why this? Because love doesn't override responsibility. He stared at me, searching for something softer in my expression. You could have destroyed me publicly, he said. You didn't. I didn't need to. Another car passed, the noise briefly filling the space between us. They're asking if you'll testify to timeline confirmation, he said. If it goes further, I will tell the truth. That's what I'm afraid of. I looked at him carefully. You're not afraid of losing me, I said. You're afraid of losing status. He didn't argue. He just stood there, hands still in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. I never thought you'd go this far, he said again, softer this time. I never thought you'd make me need to, I replied. I stepped past him toward my car. Emily? He said behind me. I paused but didn't turn. This isn't over. I know, I said, because the system was still reviewing, and once a review begins, it doesn't stop because someone feels uncomfortable. I got into my car and closed the door, leaving him standing alone under the streetlight. For the first time, he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for control, and that control was no longer his to reclaim. The official decision arrived in my inbox on a gray Thursday morning. I was reviewing invoices for a private dinner event when my phone buzzed with a forwarded internal memo. No dramatic subject line, just leadership adjustment notice. I opened it slowly, effective immediately. Joseph Turner would be reassigned from senior engineering lead to principal software engineer. His executive promotion review was suspended indefinitely. He would no longer represent the company in public speaking engagements pending completion of ethics training and compliance probation. No mention of scandal. No mention of medical concerns. Just structured consequence. I read it twice. Demotion. Not termination. Not public humiliation. Demotion. Amanda's name appeared in a separate paragraph. Her employment had been terminated following findings of non-disclosure and prior policy violations uncovered during internal review. Termination. I set my phone down and let the silence sit with me. This was the point most people imagine would feel victorious. It didn't. It felt final. Industry blogs updated within hours. TechSphere announces leadership realignment amid internal review. Again, no medical specifics. No public shaming. The system had done what it was designed to do. Joseph called at noon. They finalized it, he said without greeting. I know. I'm demoted. Yes. They're requiring mandatory ethics retraining. That's standard. Amanda's gone. I saw. His voice didn't crack. It flattened. They say I failed to disclose in a timely manner, he continued. They're calling it willful delay. Was it? I thought I had time. You had months. He exhaled slowly. They asked if I understood the fiduciary aspect of shared insurance while withholding information. And I said I didn't think of it that way. That doesn't change impact. Silence lingered. They're not firing me, he added quickly, almost defensively. They're giving me a path back. Then take it. You're not angry, he said again. I'm done being angry. There was a pause long enough that I thought he might hang up. Did you ever consider going public? He asked quietly. Yes. And you didn't? No. Why? Because public destruction wasn't my goal. But I didn't say that. Because compliance was enough, I replied. He didn't argue. After we hung up, I deleted our text thread. Not out of spite. Out of closure. That evening, I hosted a small tasting event at the restaurant. 12 guests. Seasonal menu. Delicate plating. As I drizzled reduction onto porcelain. My hands were steady. Marcus leaned close as we sent out the third course. You good? He asked again. I am, I said. And this time it felt true. Between courses, I stepped into the kitchen office and checked my phone. Amanda's LinkedIn profile had reappeared briefly earlier in the day, then vanished again. Word spread quietly that she had violated disclosure protocol at both Meridian and TechSphere. Pattern. Joseph's social media remained silent. No statements. No defenses. Just absence. The world hadn't exploded. It had recalibrated. Later that night, Hannah came by the restaurant to congratulate me on the event. It's over, she said, leaning against the stainless steel counter. Yes. You could have done more damage. I know. She studied me carefully. Do you regret anything? I thought about the kitchen the night he confessed. The wooden spoon. The calm in my voice. No, I said. Do you feel better? I feel clear. That was the difference. Anger burns hot and fast. Clarity endures. When I returned to my studio apartment after closing, I stood in the small kitchen and looked around. The space felt different now. Not smaller. Just mine. Joseph sent one final message that night. It's done. I read it once. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't accuse. He didn't plead. Just a statement. It's done. I typed back 3 words. Take responsibility fully. Then I locked my phone and set it face down on the counter. Outside, traffic hummed faintly in the distance. The city continued as if nothing monumental had happened. Because nothing monumental had... There was no viral clip. No screaming confrontation. No dramatic reveal on a giant screen. There had been documentation. Review. Consequence. Joseph still had a job. Just not the one he thought he deserved. Amanda would have to rebuild somewhere else. And I would wake up tomorrow with my name intact. I washed my hands slowly at the sink and watched the water swirl down the drain. I hadn't destroyed him. I had removed protection. There's a difference. And in that difference, I found something steadier than revenge. Control. Not over him. Over myself. The demotion wasn't loud, but it was permanent enough. And that was enough for me. The morning after everything settled, the city looked exactly the same. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window of my studio kitchen, hitting the stainless steel counter where I'd lined up my knives. The radiator hummed softly. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb. Nothing about the world announced that a chapter of my life had officially closed. I stood there for a long moment with a cup of black coffee in my hand and let the quiet sink in. The night Joseph confessed, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was betrayal. I was wrong. The worst thing would have been losing myself trying to react to it. I replayed the sequence in my mind, not with bitterness, but with distance. The kitchen, the short ribs, his calm voice saying, I slept with her. My own voice, steady, asking for divorce. The insurance portal glowing in the dark of my studio apartment. The lab code, the timeline, the summit, the button. People think revenge is dramatic. They imagine shouting, public exposure, humiliation under bright lights. But the medical report was never about disease. It was about disclosure. It was about the moment he realized something could affect me and chose silence. That silence mattered more than the affair. Affairs are reckless. Silence is calculated. I didn't blast anything on social media. I didn't post screenshots. I didn't tag his company in a viral thread. I submitted documentation to the place designed to evaluate integrity.
That's all.
And when the system did its job, I stepped back. Joseph was demoted. Amanda lost her position. The summit was rescheduled without his name attached to it. No headlines screamed scandal. No friends called to ask for gossip. It was quieter than anyone expected, which is why it worked. I rinsed my coffee cup and set it carefully in the sink. For weeks, I had been running on precision. Documentation. Alignment. Timing. Now there was nothing left to press. No more buttons. Just space. Later that afternoon, I met with a local real estate agent about a small storefront lease for a concept kitchen I'd been dreaming about for years. Not because of Joseph. Not to prove anything. Because I finally had the clarity to do it. We walked through a narrow space with exposed brick walls and tall front windows. Dust hung in the air. It needed work. But I could see it. Open shelving. A small tasting bar. 6 tables at most. Intimate. Mean. The agent talked numbers while I imagined plating dishes in a room that belonged entirely to me. When I left, I didn't check Joseph's social media. I didn't search Amanda's name. I didn't open any compliance portals. For the first time in months, I wasn't monitoring anything. That evening, I stood at my kitchen counter and chopped herbs slowly, deliberately. The rhythm felt familiar. Grounding. I thought about the word he kept using. Escalation. He thought I escalated. What I did was align action with consequence. And that's different. Before I went to bed, I opened my laptop one last time, not to revisit files, but to close them. The documentation package was still saved on my desktop. I hovered over it for a second, then moved it into an archived folder. Not deleted. Just archived. There are lessons you don't erase. You store them. I leaned back in my chair and let myself feel something I hadn't fully allowed yet. Relief. Not because he suffered, but because I didn't lose my temper. I didn't lose my dignity. I didn't lose my sense of control. He confessed. I signed. He thought that was the end. But the medical report changed everything. Not because it was explosive, but because it exposed the difference between words and actions. Integrity isn't a speech. It's a decision. And when that decision isn't made, systems step in. I closed my laptop and looked around my small apartment. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the condo with skyline views we once shared. But it was honest. If you've ever been blindsided by betrayal, if someone has made a decision for you without your consent, I want you to remember this. You don't have to scream to be strong. You don't have to humiliate someone to reclaim power. Sometimes, all you have to do is document. Wait. And press the button when the time is right. Would you have handled it differently? Would you have confronted him publicly? Stayed silent? Walked away without looking back? Tell me what you would have done. I read every story. Because every story carries a lesson. And if you believe that dignity can be stronger than drama, stay with this channel. There are more stories like mine where betrayal meets strategy, where silence isn't weakness, and where the loudest revenge isn't rage. It's timing. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do after someone breaks your trust is choose not to break yourself. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.